Well, hi there. This is a boa. And so is this. And so is this. And so is this. Boas, including members like boa constrictors and anacondas, might be the most famous and feared group of non-venomous snakes on the planet. And they're found on every snake-possessing continent except for Australia. The largest snake on the planet, at least by mass, is a boa. It's time to dig into the second largest subfamily of boas, the family Erycinae, the Old World sand boas. Old World sand boas are all over the Old World, Africa, Asia, and Europe, but also North America. So, world sand boas might be more appropriate. In fact, they're found on every continent where you find boas today, except for the one where boas likely originated, South America. Right now, we need to discuss the sand boas. And I'm dropping the moniker Old World because, while the majority of species are in the Old World, 2 of the 3 genera are in the New World. So Old World sand boas seems like a fitting name for the genus Eryx. But New World sand boas, or even North American sand boas, seems like a fair name for the other 2. But let's start with the Old World sand boas and move on to their North American closest relatives. And it is a solid place to start. There are 13 species in the genus Eryx. If you add up all of the boa species in the 4 subfamilies smaller than Erycinae, guess how many species you get? 13. So Eryx is kind of a big deal. And yet most reptile enthusiasts have only heard of 1, maybe 2 species. And as goofy looking and weird as those 2 are, they aren't the goofiest looking or weirdest members of the genus. But we'll start with the species that you're most likely to know. Eryx colubrinus, the Kenyan sand boa. From Kenya, Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Tanzania, and Somalia. So East African sand boa might be a better name for them. But whatever you call it, if you only know 1 sand boa, at least 1 Old World sand boa, then this is probably the one that you know. Like most sand boas, they are relatively small, though females can get nearly a meter long. Males are considerably smaller. They're heavily built fossorial snakes with rather small heads and somewhat blunt tails. Smooth scales in the front, rough keeled scales in the back, and goofy looking dorsally oriented eyeballs. Their coloration is quite striking, with an orange dorsal on a black background with a white belly. Of course, you'll hardly see those colors because they spend almost all of their time buried in the sand with just their goofy googly eyeballs sticking out. So if you only know 1 truly Old World sand boa, it's probably this one. But if you know a second one, it's probably this one, Eryx conicus, the rough-scaled sand boa of Pakistan, Nepal, India, and Sri Lanka. They are overall very similarly proportioned to East African sand boas, but do get a tiny bit closer to a meter long. Despite a fairly similar shape, other than a much pointier tail, you should never confuse them with East Africans. As you might have guessed, their scales are more keeled all over, so they have rougher scales. They also tend to be brown, with a darker dorsal pattern in the form of blotches or a zigzag instead of orange and black. Learning to code can feel frustrating. Endless tutorials, long lectures, and slow progress. But what if it felt more like playing a game? That's where the sponsor of today's video, boot.dev, comes in. Boot.dev is hands down the ultimate and most fun way to master backend development. It's not just another online coding course. It's designed to keep you engaged, just like a great video game. You'll be writing real code in Python and Go, earning experience points, leveling up, and even battling in community boss fights. Boot.dev throws you straight into hands-on coding challenges that prepare you for a real career in backend development. If you need help, their AI-powered bear wizard, Boots, will guide you through problems, and there's an amazing Discord community to keep you motivated. Right now, you can try boot.dev for free in guest mode, and when you're ready to kickstart your future career, use my code CLINT for 25% off your first payment, or even your first year if you choose the annual plan. And with boot.dev's 30-day no questions asked refund policy, there's 0 risk. You'll only pay if you love it. So what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description and start leveling up your learning today. So those are the 2 that you're most likely to know already. which is cool. There are 11 more, such as Eryx borii, the Boris sand boa, endemic to northern Somalia, which is very similar in appearance to the Somali sand boa, Eryx somalicus, which is from the same place, though the Somali sand boa likely also occurs in Ethiopia, as sand boas have no respect for national borders. Both species are generally dark brown with about 30 white bands, which sometimes fuse to form a Y shape. The big difference between these two rarely encountered snakes is that the Boris sand boas are very thin for a sand boa, whereas Somali sand boas have a much more typical sand boa build. Boris sand boas also have more belly scales, over 190 instead of just over 160. So you can count those if you think you might have just found a really hungry Somali sand boa. And just like that, we're down to just 9 more true old world sand boas. So let's talk about the most ironically named sand boa, Eryx elegans, the super drab and boring looking elegant sand boa. Seriously, it's just a small sand boa, about 1/3 of a meter long, that is light brown with irregularly slightly darker brown spots. It's not ugly, but probably the least elegant looking of all sand boas. Maybe they have really great manners. Or maybe the standards of elegance are just different in Turkmenistan, Iran, and Afghanistan. Maybe being mid is the peak of elegance in the Middle East. Because look at the similarly sized sand boa Eryx jayakari. It's also from the Middle East, coming from Saudi Arabia, Iran, Oman, Kuwait, and Yemen. And while I recognize that sand boas are never all that elegant, for a sand boa, I mean, how much more elegant can you get? But is it the elegant sand boa? No, it's the Arabian sand boa, or Jayakar's sand boa. Not mid enough to be the elegant sand boa. It's just a different standard. Not wrong, just different. And the Arabian sand boa is far from mid. Not only is it spectacularly beautiful, but it's also an oddball for a boa, especially a sand boa, because they lay eggs. As we've already discussed, boas are, with now 2 exceptions, ovoviviparous, which means that in many ways they produce normal amniotic eggs, but they don't lay them, but rather incubate them internally and only deliver them as they are, for lack of a better word, hatching, though they don't tend to have any sort of a calcified shell. Well, Arabian sand boas lay eggs with shells. But the reality is that they have likely re-evolved shelled eggs in the not so distant, at least geologically speaking, past. So that's pretty far from mid. What is pretty close to the middle, however, are their eyeballs. They're super high, even for a sand boa. Possibly the goofiest face of all of the sand boas. And that's saying something. So maybe they're not all that elegant after all. They have super smooth scales, and the truth is that of all the sand boas, they may be the best at living under the sand. Just a beautiful snake with a goofy as heck face. And eggs. Might be my favorite sand boa. But there are more. Like Eryx jaculus, the Javelin sand boa, which is more of a typical sand boa. In fact, it is the sand boa against which all other legit old world sand boas are compared in science. The type species for the genus Eryx. And it makes sense. This boa has a huge range. If you know sand boas because you find them regularly in the wild, this is probably the sand boa that you know. It is found in part of Europe, Asia, and Africa, and everywhere in between. It gets to about 80 centimeters, so neither huge nor small for a sand boa. Generally, it looks a lot like a Kenyan sand boa, but the coloration is more variable. They tend to be some sort of dark with lighter irregular dorsal markings and a light belly. The best way to identify them is probably by the dark stripe-like pattern connecting their eye to the back of their mouth. That isn't always there, but it's very common. And just like that, we're more than halfway through the sand boas. And there are some really exciting sand boas left. Like this one, Eryx johnii, the Indian sand boa. Look at how cool it is. Not elegant, obviously, but very cool. From Iran, Pakistan, and India. They're about 60 centimeters long and sometimes nearly a meter, so on the bigger side for a sand boa. And red! Often with faint black bands. But red! Red sand boa is another common name for them. And yeah, it's a good one. And it has one of the least absurd looking of all sand boa faces. It still has a shovel for a face, but those eyes are in a somewhat normal snake position. It really doesn't look much like a planarian at all, just like a small-headed boa. It's about as elegant of a head as you're gonna find on a sand boa, though again, clearly not elegant. That would be outrageous. But while we're on the subject of ironic names, let's talk about Eryx miliaris, the Tartar sand boa, also known as the dwarf sand boa of Iran, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Mongolia, Russia, and China. Having such a large range, they have highly variable patterns, but most seem to be a light brown in color with a much darker dorsum that is interrupted by irregular patches or spots that match the base color. And sometimes those patches have a rufous color inside of them, which is stinkin' rad, if not elegant. So what's ironic about these dwarf sand boas? Oh, nothing. Other than the fact that they're well over a meter long, over 1.2 meters. Even males, which are generally much smaller than females in sand boas, are 3/4 of a meter long. So they're the biggest sand boas we've discussed so far. So dwarf sand boa seems like a totally elegant name for them. I guess at this point, the only question is whether or not the dwarf sand boa is the largest of all the sand boas. Is its name ironic or maximally ironic? And we do still have 4 sand boas to explore, so it is possible that there could be an even bigger sand boa, like the pygmy or nano sand boa. So let's take a look at the remaining 4. And we'll start with Eryx muelleri, the Saharan sand boa of, well, the Sahara Desert. Specifically, the southern and western Sahara in Africa. Not all of these common names have to be outrageous. At this point, you almost expect the Saharan sand boa to be from the Amazon rainforest. But no, this one actually is from where you would expect it to be from. And it might be the prettiest one with the weirdest reproduction. They're similar in overall color to the Kenyan sand boa, but their scales are much smoother and they're brighter in color. The dark blotches on their backs are more regular in shape and size. They're basically 2 parallel and overlapping rows of ovals that frequently blend together to form poorly aligned Venn diagrams and saddles. And they also have kind of a hook to the end of their tails. And they're smaller, at least than those gigantic dwarf sand boas, at less than 60 centimeters in most cases. So a pretty normally sized sand boa. But I told you that they have weird reproduction. Not compared to a strepsipteran, but weird for a boa. We have already discussed that most boas are ovoviviparous, essentially incubating shellless eggs inside until they hatch. We have discussed a few oddballs that lay weirdly shelled eggs, including one sand boa. So how do you get from unshelled internally incubated eggs to shelled externally incubated eggs? Well, Saharan sand boas are glad you asked. How about producing eggs with thin, semi-transparent shells that they incubate internally till they're a few days from hatching and then lay so they can finish incubating externally? How about that? Because that's what they do, which is pretty weird. So the Saharan sand boa has weird reproduction, has a non-ironic name, and is a normally sized sand boa, not a behemoth like the dwarf sand boa. The next one I also assume to be smaller than the dwarf sand boa, though information is very limited on this one as it was only described a few years ago. It is called Eryx sistinensis. It looks a great deal like the Indian sand boa, and both of them exist in Iran where this new species was found. It appears to be more of a brown than red, but so are some Indian sand boas. It has very distinct bands on its tail, but so do some Indian sand boas. But the tail seems to be slightly pointier than that of the Indian sand boa, so that helps. It also has a different number of dorsal scale rows, but you have to be pretty committed to identifying sand boas before you're going to stop and count those out. So there are some differences if you know what you're looking for. However, it was only because of genetic analysis that we discovered that they were a different species. A theme that we will discuss again when we get to the new species of green anaconda that we just discovered. Anyway, I don't think that there is any evidence to suggest that Eryx sistinensis is significantly larger than the Indian sand boa, so let's move on. Only 2 left. And let's start with Eryx vittatus of Tajikistan, the eastern sand boa. Being from only one nation that most people don't even know exists, it is unsurprising that it is very poorly known. And while I've not heard that they're particularly large, it does seem that they were once classified as the same species, but a different subspecies, as the dwarf sand boa. So if you find one well over a meter long, please let me know. I do read most of the comments on these videos. But that gets us to our final true Old World sand boa, Eryx whitakeri, Whitaker's sand boa of India, which has the least planarian head of all of the true Old World sand boas. Honestly, it looks more like a North American sand boa than it does an Old World sand boa. I love that head. Honestly, I mean, this one isn't going to get much of a laugh out of people, but it's pretty good looking. I've always liked boa heads, and I really like the coloring too. Very Madagascar ground boa. A light brown with a darker brown irregular dorsal. Very similar to the rough-scaled sand boa, but with much smoother scales. And given that they are both found in India, knowing this distinction could be of value. But how big is it? Less than 80 centimeters. Which means that if there is a bigger sand boa anywhere on Earth than the dwarf sand boa, it might need to be on the other side of the world. In the New World, where the other two genera of Old World sand boas live. Because of irony. The other two genera being the genus Lycanura, the rosy boas, and the genus Carina, the rubber boas, which are more closely related to one another than they are to the true Old World sand boas. Each genus includes only 2 species, so despite there being more genera in the New World, the species diversity of sand boas is still greater in the Old World. And despite being a family that originated in the New World, I believe that these are the only 4 native boid species in North America north of Mexico. In fact, they might be the only snakes with hind limbs north of Mexico. And it isn't difficult to distinguish them one from the other. It's only difficult to determine which one is more wonderful. Rubber boas are patternless brown to green snakes with lighter bellies and soft unkeeled scales. They have small heads and blunt shield-like tails that resemble the head and may serve as a decoy head when attacked by predators, since they are as harmless as any vertebrate predator on the planet. They don't bite, they can't run, their only defense is to curl up in a ball and poke you with their blunt tail and hope that you're overcome by their cuteness. Honestly, they look more like Calabar pythons than they do like other sand boas, though you aren't going to confuse them with those either. A rubber boa is very easy to identify. Distinguishing between the 2 species of rubber boas? That's much harder. Unless you know where they were found. Carina bote, the northern rubber boa, is found all over the western part of North America, as far east as Colorado and going up into Canada. They are the northerlymost boas in the world. And the reality is that extreme latitudes and elevations favor live-bearing snakes over egg layers, as they're more able to successfully gestate offspring in cooler climates. I find rubber boas with some regularity here in Utah, but only up in the mountains. The southern rubber boa, Carina umbratica on the other hand, is found only in the San Bernardino and San Jacinto Mountains in Southern California. But neither species can rival the colossal dwarf sand boa for size, topping out at around 84 centimeters, with females being considerably larger than males, as with most other sand boas. So if there is a bigger sand boa than the dwarf anywhere on Earth, it will need to be in the genus Lycanura. You're never going to confuse a rosy boa with a rubber boa, if for no other reason than that they have stripes. They also have comparatively pointy tails and more defined heads than most sand boas. And though they come in a variety of colors, I don't know any of them to be green. But they're still delightful as heck with soft, smooth scales unlike most true Old World sand boas. There is a lot of color variation, as well as variation in how crisp or pixelated the stripes are in both species of rosy boas. So it's difficult to nail down a hard and fast rule as to how to tell them apart. That said, the desert rosy boa, Lycanura trivirgata, is found throughout the desert regions of the southern United States and northern Mexico. The coastal rosy boa, Lycanura orcudi on the other hand, is found only on the coast of the southern United States, east only to Arizona and into southern Nevada, limited to the Mojave and Sonoran deserts. So everywhere east of that, you'll know that you have a desert rosy boa. In my experience, the stripes of coastal rosy boas tend to be less well defined than those of desert rosy boas, so you can use that with some accuracy if you're in a location where both species occur. But the big question is, how big do they get? And the answer is that they can get over a meter long as about 112 centimeters, which is huge for a sand boa, but does not make them quite as long as the size champion of all sand boas, the dwarf sand boa. You know, because of irony. But nonetheless, the sand boas are a large and what I might call elegant group of delightful little boas, though not the most speciose subfamily of all. Hopefully you've enjoyed this clip from our feature-length documentary covering every species of boa on Earth. If you want to see more, please check it out. As always, like and subscribe, and we hope to see you real soon.